In June of 2009, the world stopped breathing. Michael Jackson, the most famous human being on the planet, was suddenly gone. But while millions of fans collapsed in shock, there was one small voice that the world barely heard. A voice trembling behind dark sunglasses. A child standing in the middle of global chaos, trying to understand a word no one had ever explained to her before: death. What happened in the hours after Michael Jackson died would forever change his youngest daughter's life. Her reaction wasn't planned. It wasn't scripted. And it wasn't meant for the cameras. Yet one moment, just a few seconds, would quietly become one of the most heartbreaking scenes in pop culture history. Why did she say what she said? What was happening behind the scenes, away from the headlines? And how did that single moment reshape who she would become? The full truth was never fully told until now. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our emotional stories about Michael Jackson. Los Angeles, June 25th, 2009. The sun rose like any other day, unaware that it was about to witness history collapse. Inside a quiet home, far from screaming fans and flashing cameras, Michael Jackson's youngest daughter was still asleep. She had no idea that the world she knew was about to fracture in ways she would never fully recover from. Paris Jackson was only 11 years old. To her, Michael wasn't a legend. He wasn't the king of pop. He was simply Dad, the man who braided her hair, who laughed too loud during cartoons, who whispered bedtime stories in a soft, almost shy voice. That morning, adults moved differently. Voices were hushed. Phones rang without answers. Hallways felt longer than usual. And somewhere behind closed doors, a truth was being debated: when and how to tell a child that her father was gone forever. Michael Jackson had always tried to shield his children from the brutality of the world. Masks, umbrellas, private schools, all was meant to protect them from exactly this moment. But now, there was no protection left. When the words finally came, they didn't sound real. Your father has passed away. Paris didn't scream. She didn't cry at first. She froze. In her mind, death was something distant, something that happened in movies, something that happened to other people, not to the man who promised he'd always come back from tour, not to the voice she expected to hear that night saying, "Good night, baby." Outside, helicopters hovered. News vans multiplied. The world was already mourning. But inside that room, a little girl was still waiting for her father to walk through the door. Hours later, she would be dressed in black. She would be led into a public farewell no child should ever endure, and millions of eyes would soon be fixed on her. What no one realized was that Paris Jackson was carrying something far heavier than grief. She was carrying a sentence she had never said out loud before, and when she finally would, it would shatter everyone who heard it. The house was no longer quiet. By midday, the silence that once protected Michael Jackson's children had been invaded by the sound of helicopters slicing through the sky, reporters shouting into phones, and strangers gathering outside gates they had never been invited to cross. For Paris, it felt like the walls themselves had begun to close in. She sat on a couch that suddenly felt too big, her feet barely touching the floor. Her brothers were nearby, each lost in their own private version of disbelief. Adults moved in and out of rooms, speaking in fragments, avoiding eye contact, whispering as if volume alone could undo reality. No one had prepared her for this part. Michael Jackson had spent years teaching his children about kindness, about privacy, about the beauty of the world beyond fame. But he had never taught them what happens when the world wants a piece of your pain. Paris clutched a small object in her hand, something she had grabbed without thinking. It was one of her father's jackets, soft and oversized, still carrying a trace of his familiar scent. She pressed it to her face, breathing it in, as if that alone might pull him back. Outside those walls, headlines were already forming. Michael Jackson dead at 50. Inside, Paris still couldn't make sense of the word dead. She asked the same question again and again. So, when is he coming home? No answer ever felt right. As the days stretched on, decisions were made quickly, too quickly. A public memorial would be held. Millions would watch. The world demanded closure, tribute spectacle. And somehow, Michael Jackson's children were expected to stand in the center of it all. Paris overheard adults debating whether she should attend. She's too young. She needs to be there. Michael would have wanted. Michael. His name landed differently now. Heavy. Permanent. No one asked Paris what she wanted. By the time she realized she would be attending the memorial, it was already decided. A black dress was laid out on her bed, shoes polished, hair gently brushed by hands that trembled despite their best efforts. She stared at her reflection, barely recognizing herself. The girl in the mirror looked older. Her eyes were swollen, rimmed red, as if grief had rushed in overnight and refused to leave. She practiced not crying. Someone had told her, gently but firmly, that there would be cameras. Just stay close to your family, they said. Hold your brother's hands. You don't have to say anything. But grief doesn't follow instructions. At the Staples Center, the air felt electric and unbearable. Flowers stretched as far as the eye could see. Fans cried openly. Strangers hugged strangers. Michael Jackson's music echoed through the space, celebrating a life while ignoring the unbearable absence it now carried. Paris walked slowly, her steps unsure. She felt small, swallowed by the enormity of the moment, by the weight of a legacy she never asked to inherit. She kept her head down, but she could feel the eyes on her. Millions of people weren't just watching Michael Jackson's memorial. They were watching his children. She squeezed her brother's hands tighter. One of them whispered something she didn't hear. Her ears rang. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. Time blurred. Speeches passed. Songs played. Applause rose and fell like waves she couldn't escape. Every tribute reminded her of something personal. A laugh, a hug, a promise. Then, suddenly it happened. A microphone was placed closer. Someone leaned down and quietly asked, "Paris, would you like to say something?" The question felt like a door opening, without warning. She wasn't ready. She hadn't planned anything. No notes, no script, just a storm of words trapped behind her ribs, pressing, begging to be released. Her hands shook. Her throat closed. For a moment, she considered shaking her head, stepping back, disappearing into the crowd. That would have been easier, safer. But then she thought of her father. Not the superstar. Not the icon. The man who kissed her forehead before bed. Who told her she was brave. Who promised he'd always protect her. And something inside her shifted. Paris stepped forward. The microphone felt cold. Heavy. Far too big for her small hands. The room fell silent. A silence so deep it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. She looked out and saw thousands of faces. Beyond them, millions more watching from screens across the globe. Her voice wavered at first. I just wanted to say... She stopped, swallowed. Her eyes filled, but she didn't look away. Ever since I was born, Daddy has been the best father you could ever imagine. The words came out raw, unfiltered, real. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Paris continued, her voice cracking, her grip tightening on the microphone as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. He was always there for us, making sure we were okay, teaching us how to be good people. Tears streamed down her face now, unhidden, unstoppable. And I just wanted to say, I love him so much. The moment shattered something collective. Adults cried openly. Fans collapsed into sobs. Even seasoned journalists struggled to keep their composure. This wasn't a performance. This was a child grieving in real time. When Paris stepped back, her legs nearly gave out. Family members rushed to steady her, wrapping her in arms that tried and failed, to shield her from the enormity of what she had just done. She didn't know it yet, but that moment would follow her forever. Replayed, reanalyzed, remembered as brave. But bravery wasn't what she felt. She felt empty, exposed, and strangely guilty, as if she had said too much or not enough. That night, as the world praised her courage, Paris lay awake in a dark room, staring at the ceiling. The applause echoed in her ears, mixing with her father's voice in her memory. She wondered if she had honored him, or if she had given the world access to something that was supposed to stay private. One thought kept returning, sharper than the rest. If saying goodbye hurt this much, how was she supposed to live the rest of her life without him? And just as exhaustion finally pulled her towards sleep, something unexpected happened. Something that would force Paris to confront her grief in a way no one saw coming. The night after the memorial felt unnaturally quiet. The noise of the world, the cries, the cameras, the constant movement, had vanished, leaving behind a silence that pressed against Paris's chest. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow, the kind of quiet that makes your own thoughts sound too loud. She lay in bed, still wearing the black dress she had refused to take off. It felt wrong to change, as if removing it meant accepting something she wasn't ready to accept. The room smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something familiar. Her father's presence lingered everywhere, not in a ghostly way, but in the small, cruel reminders grief loves to leave behind. A hat on a chair, a book left half open, a pair of sunglasses resting where he'd last set them down. Paris stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment at the microphone again and again. Her own voice sounded strange in her memory. Older, broken. Everyone had told her she was brave. No one had asked if she was okay. Her brothers had fallen asleep hours ago, exhaustion finally claiming them. Adults had retreated into other rooms, whispering into phones, handling logistics, planning futures that Paris couldn't imagine being part of. She felt abandoned, not intentionally, but inevitably. Michael had always been the one who noticed when she couldn't sleep. He'd sit at the edge of her bed, tell her stories, make up silly voices just to see her smile. Sometimes he'd say, "You can tell me anything, baby." That thought broke her. Paris sat up suddenly, her chest tight, breath shallow. Tears spilled without warning, hot and relentless. She pressed her hands over her mouth, trying not to make a sound. Then, without fully understanding why, she whispered into the darkness, "Daddy." The word felt fragile like glass. No answer came. She waited anyway. Minutes passed. Maybe more. Time had lost its meaning. Her heart ached with a desperate hope she knew was impossible, yet couldn't let go of. "I talked today," she continued softly, her voice shaking. "I talked in front of everyone. I didn't know what to say. I hope I didn't mess it up." Her tears soaked into the pillow. "I didn't want them all looking at me like that. I just wanted you." Paris curled into herself, hugging her knees, rocking slightly the way she used to when she was younger. It was something she hadn't done in years, a regression she didn't care to hide. "I don't know how to do this without you," she whispered. "Everyone keeps saying you're proud of me, but I just want you to say it." In her grief, something strange happened. Not a voice, not a vision, but a memory so vivid it felt alive. She remembered her father's laugh, soft at first, then contagious. She remembered the way he'd say her name, stretching it out playfully. She remembered him telling her, "You're stronger than you think." Paris closed her eyes. For the first time since that terrible morning, her breathing slowed. She stayed like that for a long time, floating somewhere between memory and sleep, between unbearable pain and a fragile sense of comfort. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed. In the dream, Michael wasn't on a stage. He wasn't surrounded by lights or crowds. He was sitting beside her on the floor, legs crossed, smiling gently. "You did good," he said. She woke up crying, but this time it felt different. The next morning brought reality crashing back. Phones rang early. Schedules were discussed. Lawyers, advisors, and caretakers moved to the house with a purpose that made Paris feel invisible. At breakfast, she barely touched her food. She watched adults speak about her instead of to her. She shouldn't watch the news. She needs structure. We need to think about school. School. The word felt absurd. How was she supposed to sit in a classroom when her father had just been buried in front of the world? Later that day, a close family friend came to sit with her. Someone Michael had trusted deeply. Someone who had known him not as a star, but as a father. They didn't rush her. They didn't offer cliches. They simply said, "Your dad talked about you all the time." Paris looked up sharply. "What did he say?" The friend smiled sadly. "That you were sensitive, that you felt things deeply, and that the world might not always understand you, but that you had a strong heart." The words hit harder than expected. Paris felt both comforted and terrified, because feeling deeply wasn't just beautiful, it was dangerous. Over the following days, she began to notice how quickly her life was changing. Bodyguards became constant shadows. Privacy disappeared. Strangers felt entitled to her grief, her image, her story. She saw clips of the memorial online. Despite efforts to shield her, she watched herself cry. She watched herself speak. She watched the world react. Some called her courageous. Others called her the face of Michael Jackson's legacy. No one called her what she actually was, a grieving child. At night, she returned to the same ritual, sitting in the dark, whispering to her father, asking questions she knew would never be answered. Are you watching? Can you hear me? Did I do okay today? And slowly, something began to form inside her, not healing, but awareness. She realized that loving Michael Jackson didn't just mean missing him. It meant surviving his absence in a world that would never stop talking about him. That realization scared her more than death itself, because it meant her grief wouldn't be private. It would be inherited. And just as Paris began to understand that her pain was only beginning, an unexpected moment, small, quiet, and deeply personal, would test her strength in a way no camera ever could. Grief did not fade with time. It multiplied. Days after the memorial, Paris began to understand something terrifying. The world wasn't going to give her space to mourn. Michael Jackson's death wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a global event, and that meant her pain would never be allowed to stay private. Every morning brought new headlines. Every channel replayed old footage. Every conversation circled back to one name, Michael Jackson. At first, adults tried to shield her. TVs were turned off. Newspapers were hidden. Internet access was limited. But grief has a way of finding cracks. And so does reality. Paris overheard things she wasn't meant to hear. They say she looks just like him. That poor girl. She'll never have a normal life. Normal? She wondered what that even meant anymore. Before, her world had been carefully constructed. Quiet homes, masks for privacy, laughter behind closed doors. Michael had worked tirelessly to protect his children from the cruelty of fame, even as it followed him everywhere. Now he was gone, and the shield disappeared with him. One afternoon, Paris was taken out for a short drive. The windows were tinted, the route planned, the timing precise. Yet somehow, photographers were already there, waiting. Flashes exploded like lightning. She instinctively ducked, heart racing, breath catching in her throat. Her body reacted before her mind could process what was happening. She wasn't scared of the cameras. She was scared of what they represented. Exposure, expectation, a future where she would never be allowed to just exist. That night, Paris asked a question that silenced the room. Did Daddy know this would happen to us? No one answered right away, because the truth was complicated. Michael Jackson had known the world could be cruel. He'd lived it, but he had also believed, fiercely, that love could outweigh it, that his children, if surrounded by care, could grow beyond the noise. Now, without him, that belief felt fragile. As weeks passed, the adults around Paris began discussing her future more openly. Therapy, education, guardianship, protection. Everything sounded clinical. She didn't want plans. She wanted her father back. At night, her dreams began to change. Michael no longer appeared smiling. Instead, he stood far away, unreachable, fading just as she tried to run toward him. She would wake up gasping, heart pounding, fingers clenched as if still holding on to him. She started refusing to sleep alone. A caretaker would sit nearby until she drifted off, though it wasn't the same. Michael used to hum softly when she couldn't sleep. Sometimes he'd sing under his breath, barely audible. No one else knew how to do that. One evening, while sorting through belongings, Paris found something unexpected. A handwritten note. It wasn't addressed to her specifically. It was folded, tucked inside a book Michael used to read. The handwriting was unmistakable, looping, careful, almost delicate. She unfolded it slowly. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't poetic. They were honest. He wrote about fear. about exhaustion, about the pressure of being misunderstood, and about his children. "My kids are my light." One line read, "They are the reason I keep going, even when the world feels too heavy." Paris read it over and over until the letters blurred. This wasn't the Michael Jackson the world argued about. This was her father. And for the first time since his death, something shifted inside her. Not relief, not peace, but determination. If he had endured that much pain and still found reasons to love, then maybe she could survive this too. But the world wasn't done testing her. At a small family gathering weeks later, someone asked, casually, thoughtlessly, "Do you want to be famous like your dad?" The question hit her like a slap. She froze. Famous. As if fame were a choice. As if it were a gift. Paris looked down at her hands, small and pale against the table. She remembered the way Michael used to sigh when the doors closed behind them, the way his shoulders would relax when the cameras disappeared. That wasn't glamour. That was survival. "I don't want to be famous," she said quietly. "I just want my dad." The room fell silent. Later that night, she cried harder than she had in days. Not just for Michael, but for herself. For the childhood she felt slipping away. For the innocence she hadn't realized was already gone. She began to understand something painful but important. Losing her father wasn't just about death. It was about identity. Who was Paris Jackson without Michael there to guide her? Who was she in a world that only saw her as his daughter? The pressure grew heavier with each passing day. Expectations whispered around her. People spoke of legacy, of responsibility, of carrying a name that meant everything to everyone else. But no one asked how heavy that name felt to an 11-year-old girl. One evening, standing alone in front of a mirror, Paris studied her reflection. She saw his eyes, his cheekbones, his expressions. She touched her face gently, as if trying to understand where he ended, and she began. "I miss you," she whispered. And in that moment, she made a silent promise, one she didn't fully understand yet. She would survive, not for the world, not for the legacy, but because somewhere inside her, her father had taught her that even in darkness, there was worth in staying. What Paris didn't know was that the hardest battle was still ahead, one that would test her spirit in ways grief alone never could. And the next chapter of her life would force her to confront a truth no child should ever have to face. Grief has layers. Just when Paris thought she had reached the deepest part of her pain, the ground shifted again, revealing something underneath that hurt even more. It happened quietly. No cameras, no headlines, no dramatic moment. Just a conversation she wasn't supposed to overhear. Paris had wandered down the hallway late one afternoon, barefoot, wrapped in one of her father's old sweaters. The house was unusually tense. Voices were low, serious. Adults gathered around a table, papers spread out like evidence. She paused near the corner, unseen. "We can't hide this from her forever," someone said. "Hide what?" Paris leaned closer, her heart beginning to race. Another voice responded, strained. "She's already lost her father. She doesn't need more trauma." More trauma. The words echoed in her chest. A third voice spoke, calm but heavy. "She deserves the truth." All of them do. Paris's breath caught. Truth had become a dangerous word. She took one small step forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath her. The conversation stopped abruptly. Faces turned. Eyes widened. She had been discovered. "Paris," someone said gently, too gently, "how long have you been standing there?" She didn't answer. Instead, she asked a question that had been burning inside her since she heard the word truth. "What are you hiding from me?" Silence fell like a curtain. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone pulled out a chair and gestured for her to sit. Paris didn't want to, but her legs felt weak, unsteady. Her heart told her whatever came next would change everything. They explained slowly, carefully, choosing words the way one might walk through broken glass. They talked about her father's struggles, the pressure, the exhaustion, the loneliness he rarely showed in public. They spoke of sleepless nights, of pain he tried to hide so his children wouldn't worry. Paris listened, frozen. Then came the part she wasn't prepared for. They explained that Michael Jackson hadn't just died. He had been suffering, quietly, constantly, and despite everything he was to the world, he had been deeply human, vulnerable in ways no one was ever allowed to see. Paris felt something twist inside her. All this time, she had believed death had stolen him suddenly, unfairly, without warning. But now she was being told that he had been fighting battles long before that final day. Battles she never knew about. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. No one answered immediately, because the answer was heartbreaking. "He didn't want you to worry," someone finally said. Protecting you was everything to him. The words should have brought comfort. Instead, they brought guilt. Paris's mind raced backward through memories, moments when Michael smiled despite looking tired, when he laughed a little too hard, when he hugged her a little longer than usual. Had those been goodbyes? Had he been hurting while she was asking him to read one more story? Tears streamed down her face, silent and relentless. "I could have helped him," she whispered. A hand reached for hers, squeezing gently. "You already did," someone said, "just by being his daughter." That night, Paris couldn't sleep. Not because she missed her father. That pain was constant. But because something new had entered her grief. Understanding. And understanding hurt more than ignorance ever had. She sat on the floor of her room, surrounded by his belongings, holding the note she had found days earlier. Now the words felt heavier, more urgent. "My kids are my light." She realized something devastating. Her father had been holding on to that light while drowning in darkness, and she had never known. Anger joined her grief, not at him, but at the world, at the pressure, at the expectations that demanded perfection from a man who was already breaking. She felt small, powerless, and then, unexpectedly, something else emerged. Responsibility. If the world had failed her father, if love hadn't been enough to save him, then what did that mean for her? In the weeks that followed, Paris became quieter, more observant. She listened more than she spoke. She watched how adults spoke about Michael. Carefully, defensively, sometimes with regret. She noticed how quickly people moved on. New stories replaced old ones. The world grieved loudly, then resumed. But her grief didn't follow that schedule. One evening, she asked another question that stopped everyone in their tracks. Do people really remember who he was, or just what they want him to be? No one had a good answer, because the truth was painful. Michael Jackson had belonged to everyone, and no one at the same time. That realization scared her. If the world could misunderstand someone as kind and loving as her father, what chance did she have of being seen clearly? She began writing in a notebook. Not poems, not stories. Questions. Why do people hurt the ones they love? Why is being different so dangerous? Why wasn't love enough? Each question felt like a step toward something unknown, something heavier, but also something necessary. Paris didn't know it yet, but this revelation, this understanding of her father's hidden pain, would shape her in ways that would surface years later. It would influence her choices, her struggles, her strength, and as she closed the notebook one night, pressing it against her chest, she whispered something she had never said before. "I see you now." What she didn't realize was that seeing the truth was only the beginning, because the next chapter of her life would force her to confront whether pain defines a person, or whether it could become the foundation of resilience. And that answer would not come easily. Years passed, not quietly, but inevitably. Paris Jackson grew up in the shadow of a name that never faded. Michael Jackson's voice still echoed through radios, documentaries, arguments, celebrations. To the world, he remained eternal, untouchable, frozen in time. But to Paris, he continued to exist in smaller, quieter ways. In the songs she avoided for years because they hurt too much. In the gestures she caught herself making that mirrored his. In the moments of silence when she felt him more than she heard him. Growing up without her father didn't happen all at once. It unfolded slowly in waves. Birthdays he wasn't there for. Achievements she couldn't share with him. Questions that arrived too late to be answered. There were years when the pain nearly swallowed her. Times when grief turned inward, when confusion became anger, when missing him felt like losing him all over again, every single day, the world watched her closely, sometimes unfairly, sometimes cruelly, often forgetting that she wasn't a symbol or a headline. She was a daughter, and daughters are not meant to grow up without fathers, especially not fathers who loved as fiercely as Michael Jackson did. But somewhere along the way, Paris began to understand something her 11-year-old self could never have imagined. Grief does not disappear. It transforms. She stopped trying to outrun it, stopped fighting the memories, stopped pretending strength meant silence. Instead, she began to speak, not to cameras, not to headlines, but to herself. She learned that honoring her father didn't mean carrying his pain. It meant living beyond it, that remembering him didn't require staying broken, that love, even when it ends in loss, is still worth choosing. Michael had always taught his children about compassion, about seeing the world through empathy, not fear, about protecting innocence, not just theirs, but everyone's. Those lessons survived him. In moments of darkness, Paris returned to that night after the memorial, the first time she whispered into the dark and felt him near, not as a presence, but as a belief. You're stronger than you think. She carried that sentence with her like armor. And one day, standing alone, older now, she made a promise, not to the world, but to the little girl she once was. She promised not to let tragedy define her, not to let fame steal her humanity, not to let grief erase joy. Most of all, she promised to live honestly, even when it hurt. Michael Jackson's legacy has been debated endlessly, his music analyzed, his life dissected, his image frozen between admiration and controversy. But the part of his legacy that mattered most was never on stage. It lived in the hearts of his children, in the way Paris learned to feel deeply without apologizing, in the way she spoke openly about pain instead of hiding it, in the way she chose authenticity over perfection. The world may remember Michael Jackson as the king of pop, but Paris remembered him as something far more important. The man who held her when she was afraid. The father who tried to shield her from a world he knew too well. The voice that still whispered strength when everything felt unbearable. Loss didn't end their connection. It changed its form. And in that transformation, Paris discovered something profound. That love does not die with the body. It survives in choices, in resilience, in the courage to keep going. Her story isn't one of tragedy alone. It's a story of survival, of a child who stood in front of the world, heart breaking, voice trembling, and still spoke love, of a daughter who lost her father, but not his influence, of a legacy carried not through fame, but through humanity. And maybe that's a part of Michael Jackson the world needed to remember most. Not the spectacle, not the myth, but the man whose greatest role was being a father, and whose greatest impact lived on the quiet strength of his youngest child. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who loves Michael Jackson. And remember, even legends face battles unknown to the world. Subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone who loves Michael Jackson.